Thanks, Kayla. Hello, everyone, and I hope everyone is doing well. Thank you for joining us today for our November live presentation. As Kayla mentioned, my name is Eric Medina. I'm the head of the True Youth Monitor, and joining me this day is Kate Turkin, the associate head of the True Youth Monitor. For those of you who aren't familiar, the True Youth Monitor is one of the Futures Company subscription offerings. Our mission is to educate clients on the youth life stage and the cohorts that traverse that life stage today. Now, a few points I'd like to make before we dive in. This presentation only scratches the surface of the in-depth data analysis, insights, and implications that we've developed for our soon-to-be-released Fall Report, Perceptions and Priorities 2014. As a result of our heritage studying young people for 32 years, we were able to dig into the archives of early millennials' attitudes, values, and beliefs, and bring that analysis forward to draw parallels and distinctions to today's young people. We've come a long way, literally and figuratively, to build this groundbreaking work. It's rare to be in a position to witness the changing of the guard from one generational cohort to another and establish seminal thinking on this new cohort while ushering in an evolution of thinking about the future of millennials. Kate and I are excited to be with you guys today to explore this generation that is critical for any youth marketer to understand. As you can see by the title, we're not talking about the millennials. There's a new generation that now makes up the youth life stage, and we'll be introducing you to them today. But before we start, let's look at what we're going to talk about. We'll explain why millennials are no longer synonymous with youth and introduce you to the cohort that is actually all about youth today. And speaking of cohorts, we'll explain why you need to understand a generational cohort's formative years. Next, we'll dive into another key factor of understanding youth, the life stage. And finally, we'll take a look at the True Youth Monitor's intellectual agenda for the year ahead. So let's get started. For the last 15 years, millennials have held sway in the marketplace and in the media. They're a large cohort with billions to spend, not to mention the influence that naturally comes with size and purchase power. They invented Facebook, created the sharing economy, and redefined the traditional terms of adulthood. As teens, they were poised to save the world, were then shell-shocked by the Great Recession, and haven't been the same, or frankly, well understood since. So it makes sense that millions of marketing dollars and countless articles have been spent on this generation. But with all due respect to the millennials, it's time to recognize that if you're thinking about them as the youth of America, you might not be thinking of them as they are today. Remember way back in the early 2000s when Beyonce and Destiny's Child introduced the word bootylicious to America? When Justin and Brittany were dating and Justin hadn't yet learned that there's a better way to do his hair? Or before LeBron became King James? Well, that was the heyday of millennials as teenagers and the beginning of marketers' quests to unlock the secrets of that generation. Fast forward to 2014, and frankly, our millennials don't look so young anymore. Beyonce is no longer a single lady. She's a businesswoman, wife, mother, and an entertainment powerhouse. Justin broke free from NSYNC and has become an international superstar, perhaps as well known for his take on the "I'm loving it" McDonald's tagline, as for recent hit singles. Brittany is a mother of 2 boys and has been through her share of grown-up problems. LeBron has gone from Cleveland to Miami and now back to Cleveland, with part of his rationale for the move being that he wants to raise his 3 kids close to his hometown. It's not just the famous millennials who have grown up. While stereotypes about delayed adulthood abound, it's clear that not all millennials are choosing to forego a full-time job for video games in mom's basement. And to be fair, those who are stuck living at home or searching for a job tell us that it's not a happy status quo. they're actively looking to move forward with their lives. In fact, home ownership and living as a couple are both in the 50% range, and parenthood isn't far behind. While lack of income may be delaying these milestones for some millennials, many of them are right on track. Given this data, it's clear why many marketers and journalists are fascinated by the millennials and are continuing to study them as they move through adulthood. But we've seen a few too many articles that still treat millennials as the youth of America, or even state that teens today are millennials. It's time to set the record straight. It's time to face facts. Millennial is no longer synonymous with youth. The oldest of the millennial generational cohort are in their mid-30s now, and the youngest are past high school. If you're a marketer focused on teens or the consumers who are driving youth trends, it's time to look beyond the millennials to the next generation. So let's define who this new generational cohort is. First, though, I'd like to just walk you through a bit to determine when one generation ended and the next began. We are officially citing 1996 as the end of the millennial generation. Why? Well, we started by looking at data from our U.S. Yankelovich monitor, and in that it showed that there were important shifts in values among parents of children under the age of 5, beginning in the late 1990s. Namely, integrity and authenticity rose in value, and parents increasingly looked for a sense of control in their lives. And the shift in values makes sense. Millennials were parented by baby boomers, while the next generation is being parented by Gen Xers and even millennials. Because birth rates signify a demographic shift, they're commonly used to mark the end of one generational cohort and the start of another generational cohort. According to the CDC, U.S. birth rates have consistently fallen over the past 20 years, indicating a generational change. Finally, the context in which young people are growing up has shifted. Millennials came of age during the consumer-centric heyday of the late 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. The next generation is facing new challenges and opportunities growing up in the shadow of the Great Recession. This is another topic we'll dig into over the next few slides. A generation's formative years provide critical insight into their values, attitudes, and beliefs, and it's worth more examination than the quick glance shown here. Now, defining a new generation is no small feat, and neither is identifying a name for them. You've heard this generation called Gen Z, the post-gens, the I-gens. At the Futures Company, we used the name N-gens as a placeholder while we worked on a more permanent moniker. But now we're ready to introduce you to the centennials. It's a name that we feel perfectly captures this generation more so than any other name that has been proposed, including our own. We've been studying, analyzing, and watching this generational cohort for 5 years already, and we've learned a lot about who they are, what makes them tick, and where they're likely to go in the future. Let's take a look at who they are and why that name is so fitting. As I mentioned earlier, we believe this name is far superior to any moniker currently being used in the marketplace, and that's for 3 key reasons. First, and perhaps most importantly, we turn to 2 demographic factors to build the case for this name. Similar to baby boomers, another name rooted in demographic realities, the centennial name will stick with this group for the duration because demographic factors will be evergreen. This first demographic factor is that the centennial cohort was born near the turn of the new century. The second demographic factor is lower birth rates. At the millennial generation's peak in 1990, the U.S. birth rate hit 16.7 per 1,000, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. In 2002, as the centennial generation moved to the fore, the U.S. birth rate fell to just 13.9 per 1,000, below Gen X's lowest annual birth rate, again, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. Finally, we believe that centennials will face smaller expectations. As children, millennials were told to unite and work within the system to change the world. As adults, they felt great pressure to save the world, but they haven't been able to rescue society for a multitude of reasons, and this failure risks becoming part of their generational baggage. On the other hand, we don't believe centennials will suffer from the impossibly high expectations that helped hamstring millennials. Although they'll be driving many of the changes we see going forward in the new century, we no longer see society pinning its hopes on a single generation. We'll have to wait and see what the future holds, but this freedom may be exactly what gives centennials the leeway to accomplish something bigger than anyone expects. Now, are centennials important? Are they ever? There are teens to be taken seriously, and adults and media are acknowledging this fact. As our friends at Time state, quote, teens today might have a mixed reputation, but there's no denying their influence. They command millions of fans on Twitter and Vine, start companies with funds they raised on Kickstarter, steal scenes on TV's most popular shows, lead protests with global ramifications, and even win Nobel Peace Prizes, unquote. The consumer and cultural landscape, adults and the media are focused on these young people like never before, from not just Time, but Reuters and even TEDx, to name just a few. Let's take a look at a few of these standout centennials, starting with one of Time's most influential teens of 2014, 14-year-old Jazz Jennings. This fall, Jazz released a book titled I Am Jazz about her life as a transgender child, and she was a special guest at the GLAAD Media Awards. Next, 15-year-old Eric Finman invented Botangle, an online educational platform that links teachers and students from around the world. Eric felt stifled at school in his hometown in Idaho, and he wanted to create a place where other curious students could learn about subjects that wouldn't normally be covered at their school, or to receive help with subjects that they were struggling with. And finally, we have 14-year-old Trisha Prabhu of Naperville, Illinois, one of our hometown girls here in Chicago. She recently made waves with her Rethink Cyberbullying Prevention app at the 2014 Google Science Fair. Her app recognizes hurtful trigger words such as stupid or ugly, and uses basic neuroscience to make would-be bullies reevaluate their actions. The entry was chosen to be among Google's 15 global finalists. Here in Chicago at the Entrepreneurial Hub 1871, they awarded her first prize in the Power Pitch competition, and she was a speaker at TEDx Teen. Now, while every generational cohort has had shining stars, these examples just scratch the surface of centennials who are influential beyond their years. From a business standpoint, if you target teens today, you already understand that this life stage is important to your bottom line. Everyone under the age of 18 is a centennial. But if you target college students, 20-somethings, or even a mix of teens and 20-somethings, you may be asking yourself if you really have to take a deep dive into this centennial cohort right now, or if you can wait a year or two. Well, we believe it's critical that you have a solid bedrock of centennial target insights and implications in your marketing toolkit today. Consider this. If you target 16 to 24-year-olds, a common youth demographic, 78% of that target is made up of millennials, represented here in the green, while 22% of them are centennials. Now, in just 2 years, centennials will make up about 50% of this target, but in 5 short years, centennials will make up 80% of your target. And a point of note, this is a fast-paced generational cohort that will not wait around or hesitate to move on the next big thing. Understanding their formative years, their values, mindsets, today will prevent you from applying outdated millennial insights and attitudes to these centennials and ensure you're poised to truly embrace this cohort as they age and evolve. Now I'm going to hand it over to Kate, and she's going to take a look at those formative years in more detail.
Thanks, Eric. So now that you have an introduction to the centennials, let's look at how generational cohort differences emerge. The key to truly understanding young people, teens in particular, is to take a holistic view of two connected forces, starting with their cohort. Every generation is different because they, of course, share different experiences, values, and attitudes during their formative years. The second factor to look at is life stage. Once you understand those cohort dynamics, you can understand how they traverse the youth life stage, including moving through their school years into young adulthood. Combined, these facets will give you a clear picture of their mindset, which is really the key to unlocking their attitudes, values, perspectives, and behaviors. And we've done this through our extensive research and analysis. So let's begin with the cohort. As I mentioned, the first step in understanding the generation is to explore the context in which they grow up. The millennials' formative years took place in the mid-1980s through the mid-1990s. This was a time of relative stability, where the fundamentals were still considered to be sound, despite some periodic reversals. They compare that to the formative years of the centennials, taking place in the early 2000s through today, which is clearly a time of unrest and uncertainty. It's worth taking a look at these formative years through several key lenses: social, technological, economic, environmental, and political. Each of these categories allows us to explore the important events, moments, and sentiments in the U.S., and together to form a cohesive picture of the world as each cohort came of age. Now, today, we're just going to look at a few examples using this framework. These examples are just a small portion of the larger analysis on a cohort's formative years, which will appear in the upcoming fall report, Perceptions and Priorities, that Eric mentioned earlier. So let's start with that social lens. Having been born into a multicultural society as part of a highly diverse generation, the millennials were taught to appreciate and value ethnic diversity. TV shows like The celebrated African American heritage and cultural pride with the aim of breaking racial stereotypes. The centennials are coming of age at a time when ethnic diversity has become the fabric of everyday life. In fact, they'll be the first minority-majority cohort in America. At the Futures Company, we're calling this a polycultural society. And as a result, the centennials are being raised to be culturally intelligent. So we have here the centennial version of the ABC's Blackish. Again, we have an upper middle-class African-American family with two professional parents. But this comedy is built around finding your place in that polycultural society, finding that comfortable spot between attachment to one's ethnic heritage, being true to oneself, and successfully navigating the broader world. Next up, technology. The millennials came of age when the internet and digital media were all about possibility, freedom, and empowerment. They were ahead of their parents and marketers in terms of their sophistication and facility with these new technologies. And they had the relative freedom to explore all that the early internet had to offer. Centennials have the advantages of being the digital natives, but they also have to deal with a very different technological environment, one that requires much higher levels of caution and care. They live in a world in which their parents feel it's their responsibility to monitor their children's online activity, and brands feel that it's their right to have access to that data. Exploration still takes place, but the centennials have needed to develop workarounds and alter their sharing practices to circumvent both types of monitoring. This requires far more thought and energy than the millennials ever needed to use in this space. The environmental conversation that millennials grew up with was littered with statements and examples of the damage that we were doing to the earth. We used so much aerosol hairspray and Freon that we created a hole in the ozone layer. We replaced the Amazon rainforest with pasture for cattle. And there was that little incident in Ukraine where we lost control over our nuclear power. While our damage to the earth continues, there's a sense that it's starting to fight back. There have always been natural disasters, but over the past decade, it seems that they've grown in both scope and frequency. Superstorms, sinkholes, and superviruses are now common stories on the local and national news. As a consequence, centennials are growing up in a world in which the consequences of our environmental neglect are becoming evident. Now, they still need to find ways to lower that impact, but they also have to deal with living with the consequences of the damage that has already been done. We predict that this is likely to give environmental issues renewed importance after many years of declining priority. Now, it's no secret that we're living in a new economic reality. The millennials grew up expecting to become part of a robust and flourishing middle class, or ideally move up a level or two in their socioeconomic standing. The centennials are witnessing the hollowing out of the middle class and subsequently ever-widening income disparity. A comfortable middle-class lifestyle is no longer a given, and it's not an easy default for them. They will have to be smarter and more strategic about planning for their future just to stay even, let alone achieve relative affluence. Finally, let's take a look at the political landscape. Democracy, by nature, creates an environment of opposing sides. But the millennials grew up during a time of relative collaboration across the aisle. Republicans worked with Democrats and vice versa in order to push forward important legislation. Think about NAFTA and No Child Left Behind. Even polar political opposites like Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch were friends who often collaborated on important legislation. The centennials, on the other hand, are experiencing an era of political polarization, with the two parties actively working to block the other's progress, and where any sort of across-the-aisle cooperation or friendship is considered a betrayal. The result has been the least productive Congress in history. Government appears to be all about the politics and not about the people that the politicians were elected to serve. It's another example of the centennials having a front row seat as witnesses to an important societal institution that is simply not working. But what does all of this mean? Well, when we look at all of those formative events together, specific cohort characteristics begin to crystallize. Coming of age in an opportunity-rich environment offers many luxuries, including the ability to explore and follow one's interests, and putting off thinking about the future while just enjoying being young. The millennials enjoyed a youth of positive attention, self-esteem building, tremendous possibility, and idealistic ambitions for themselves as individuals and as a generation. In contrast, the centennials are growing up with a less idealistic and more pragmatic edge. They're facing situations that the millennials didn't have to deal with until early adulthood. And as a result, the centennials are growing up more savvy in graver times when everybody doesn't win, choices are limited, and success is harder to come by. Next, we'll take a look at two distinct types of intelligence exhibited by the two generational cohorts. The millennials have intrapersonal intelligence. They're great at being aware of their own emotional states, feelings, and motivations. They tend to enjoy self-reflection and analysis, including daydreaming, exploring relationships with others, and assessing their personal strengths. In many ways, the millennial self-esteem and positive psychology-oriented upbringing emphasized and really supported this type of intelligence. Centennials, on the other hand, are seeing a world in which there is a premium on practical intelligence. This is the ability that individuals use to find the best fit between themselves and the demands of their environment. It will enable the centennials to figure out how to succeed in an opportunity-impoverished and less forgiving landscape. Now, this is not to say that each generation is wholly lacking in the other sort of intelligence. The labels indicate the type of intelligence that their upbringing fostered, valued, and therefore emphasized. Finally, the millennials became very adept at working the system. In particular, they're skilled at using social media to aggregate demand, apply pressure to brands and institutions to get their way, and rally like-minded individuals to their cause. Even while working within the system, they found new ways to gain advantage. In many ways, millennials were the poster children of the youth arm of the consumer empowerment revolution. But working the system requires that the system works and that you have some sort of faith in it. One of the defining aspects of the world in which centennials are being raised is that basic societal institutions, or the systems, simply aren't working. They're either broken or compromised or in need of significant upheaval. This is leading to a generation that is becoming known for its skill at working around the system. Rather than pressuring the system to do the right thing or to listen to them, centennials are bypassing it entirely and creating their own solutions, products, fixes, and life paths. Ultimately, the product of their workarounds may be a major aspect of their enduring legacy and impact in society. Of course, cohort characteristics evolve over time as the generation deals with new challenges that arise. You'll recall that the early traits ascribed to the Xers and the Millennials shifted as they aged into later life stages and dealt with current events. Still, the formative events that they experienced had great impact on how these generations look today. So while we can't promise that the centennials will always look exactly like this list, we can say that the traits developed during their formative years will influence them as they progress through life. So now that you have a clear picture of their formative years, I'm going to hand it back over to Eric to look at the life stage pillar.
Thanks, Kate. So as we move into life stage, I want to reinforce that what I'm about to share is just a small portion of the data, analysis, insights, and implications we have on this topic. Now, life stage is all about how young people traverse their teen and early 20-something years. While individual experiences throughout the youth life stage may differ, all young people navigate three interconnected quests. The youth truisms, the most universally accepted shorthand for understanding the youth life stage. The first youth truism we'll explore is a prerequisite for the others: self-determination and control. The teen life stage is a time to prepare for independence and hopefully for future success. Teens tasked with developing a sense of personal autonomy must find the strength to make decisions as well as the confidence to believe in those decisions and stand behind them. The quest for autonomy can cause friction between authority figures and children that goes far beyond chafing at curfews. Now, this isn't about smart remarks and bratty behavior. It's about gaining the insight, skills, and confidence necessary to leave the nest. Let's take a look at how the outgoing and incoming youth cohorts differ in their approach to this quest. While millennials believed in comforting assurances that they were special in their own ways and that their futures were essentially assured, the younger cohort has learned harder lessons earlier in life. Centennials are beginning to understand that the future is what they make of it. As we were digging through the wide set of data that we have, we were surprised by this data point that almost 60% of 12 to 15-year-olds tell us that they're worried about not being prepared for the future. Now, our second truism is experimentation and sensation seeking. Youth is, of course, a time of exploration. We all remember it, perhaps fondly. Young people are, more than in any other life stage, encouraged to follow their bliss and identify areas of personal potential. What's more, the cost of such experimentation is relatively low, and the opportunities are perhaps richer than in any other stage of life. Discovering tastes and talents, one step in determining a future life path, allows teens to learn important life lessons and experiences. It's not all work, however. Some choices are just made to take it out for a spin, if you will, to unleash sheer joy and curiosity fulfillment. Of course, this area of endeavor can vex parents who are not comfortable seeing their kids engage in risky, unsafe, or extreme behaviors. If this quest is a natural rite of passage for young people, how do millennials and centennials differ in their approaches? Well, millennials' formative years were a time of relative stability, where the fundamentals were still considered to be sound despite periodic reversals. Frivolity ruled the day, and there seemed to be few consequences to test or naivete. Centennials, on the other hand, have had experiences that have been completely different. Even as teenagers, they have a more sober relationship with the concept of fun, seeing here the real stark difference in millennials as teenagers in 2000 versus centennials as teenagers here in 2014. Finally, we explore self-expression and status seeking. In the midst of the personal and social upheaval of the teen years, most young people look for a peer support network that offers safety in numbers and a shared interest in a common cause. Affiliation with a like-minded group can allow fellowship even as it provides an audience for an individual to air his or her unique voice. But here again, millennials and centennials show stark contrasts in their approach to this truism. Let's take a look. Where millennials employed myriad outward-facing cues to broadcast their interests, affiliation, and status to peers, centennials appear to be taking a much lower-key approach. In short, where millennials look to project an aspirational image of perfection, and they still do, centennials seem less tied to managing other people's expectations of them. Even as avid social media sharers, almost 2/3 of centennials say that they think carefully about what they post online, and not because they're worried about the cool factor, but rather because they want to make sure their authentic self stays that way. So now we've arrived at their mindset, the key to the equation of understanding youth. Over the past several slides, some consistent themes have emerged that help paint a picture of two starkly different generational cohorts. Let's start with the millennials and how they approach the youth truisms. Millennials were raised to believe that the fundamentals, for example, hard work leads to success, college leads to jobs, etc., were still considered to be sound despite bumps in the road, and that their future was all but guaranteed. With their relatively light-hearted formative years, they were able to focus on less pressing matters, so fun was certainly something that was very important. And they looked to express themselves through a shiny outer shell that reflected their uniqueness to their peers. Centennials, on the other hand, learned from an early age that consensus is a rare commodity in the modern world and that the future doesn't care about shared assumptions. Hard times call for hard work, and everyone is accountable to herself. They know that fun is something to be had, but it shouldn't be a defining characteristic. And finally, attention for centennials is no longer its own reward. Rather, it is a tool for creating their own solutions, fixes, and life paths. So their contrasting formative years plus their differing approaches to the youth truisms mean that centennials and millennials have starkly different mindsets. Millennials' formative years didn't exactly leave them well prepared for the current political, economic, and social climate. And the interpersonal intelligence they honed hasn't given them the skills to adapt as quickly as needed to the changing landscape. As such, they're blindsided and back on their heels. For centennials, the crucible of their upbringing has prepared them for the unstable world in which they live. That world requires grit, savvy, and resilience. Thus, centennials have their eyes wide open and are up on their toes. Now, Kate's going to take a look at our agenda for the year ahead and close us out.
Thanks, Eric. Now, let's start with some level setting. Earlier in the presentation, we told you to forget about the millennials, but our intention clearly isn't to ignore them entirely. It is critical that you're able to fully differentiate between the centennials and the millennials in your day-to-day work, and that you understand the traits that are unique to each of the generational cohorts. And we're here to help with that. In future work from the True Youth Monitor, you'll see millennial and centennial data broken out separately. We'll be specific about where insights or implications apply to both groups, or provide dedicated commentary for each generation. Through upcoming True Views and True Talks, we'll highlight some of the rich millennial data we have as the youngest of that generation fully transition into adulthood. So what else will we be up to in 2015? Well, 2014 was the first year that we developed two full distinct reports. We had Consumers and Commerce in the spring and Perceptions and Priorities in fall. The reports include rich perspective about the youth cohorts on key topic areas, including their shopping habits, media behaviors, values, attitudes, and activities. Together, the reports paint a comprehensive picture of the youth life stage today. So 2015 will continue this format, including the return of our brand meter for a third year this spring. Let's quickly do a brand meter overview for those of you on the phone who aren't as familiar with it. The brand meter is our proprietary framework. It quantifies young people's relationships with 400 brands across 11 categories. It helps you better understand how and why your brand is winning or losing with the youth target. The brand meter measures three key pillars of a brand's strength with youth: affinity, advocacy, and momentum. Taken together, the pillars summarize the resonance a brand has with young consumers, spanning emotional, behavioral, and social currency connections. A brand's composite score can be compared to a category norm or versus key competitors to gauge your overall position in the youth marketplace. And those individual pillar scores can be used to diagnose where strengths or weaknesses lie. So if you're interested in looking at 2013 or 2014 scores for your category, or if you have questions about the brand meter, please reach out to your account team. This is a critical diagnostic framework for any brand concerned with and focused on reaching teens and 20-somethings. So in 2015, we'll reprise the brand meter as part of our spring Consumers and Commerce report. Specifically, we'll explore where and how centennials and millennials have similar or different orientations towards categories and brands. We'll also look at how those attitudes have changed over the past 3 years, in particular for the millennials as they continue to move into young adulthood. But beyond the reports, we want to share our intellectual agenda for the year ahead with you. We're going to be focused on learning more about the centennials and the 20-something millennials in 4 specific topic areas: their current mindsets, their cultural intelligence, their digital perspective, and finally, early independence for the centennials. Let's take a quick look at each. So earlier, Eric introduced you to the differing cohort mindsets. This year, we'll deep dive into how these mindsets are impacting each generation's behaviors, attitudes, and values. We'll take a look at how long the millennials have truly been back on their heels and how long we think that they'll stay there. What are they still being blindsided by, and what have they come to expect? With the centennials, we'll look to understand if they'll stay up on their toes as they face even more realities in their late teen years, and how approaching the world with their eyes wide open impacts their relationships with brands and products. These are vastly different states of mind, and will help you understand the implications that they have for your product and your communication strategies. Next, we believe that the centennials will exhibit a cultural intelligence like no previous cohort. Our U.S. Yankelovich Monitor defines cultural intelligence as truly and effectively relating to those who are different from themselves, engaging in effective dialogue, working together with maximum efficiency, and developing strong personal relationships. In other words, they can transcend boundaries and individual characteristics with the resilience and flexibility to face change and adversity. And we believe that these skills and intelligence will lead to an outsized influence well beyond the centennials' cohort size and even age. So we'll be paying close attention to that influence and how it may drive marketplace changes across categories. We mentioned this earlier in the technology section, but it's really important to acknowledge that centennials are the true digital natives. Millennials have been characterized as such, but in reality, they were the digital immigrants, adopting technology as it came of age. Centennials, on the other hand, have only known a world in which technology dominates our everyday lives. In fact, centennials have a much more hopeful view of the power of technology, and this optimism for technology is in line with some of the broader generational work that our U.S. Yankelovich Monitor has done recently. From their State of the Consumer report, technology is where people look to for inspiration, where they can think about big dreams. This is where thoughts of reinvention, redefinition, and a better life are not just possible, but perhaps even probable. This is the area of people's lives where true aspirations are taking root. Therefore, we'll be keeping a close eye on how the centennials will use their digital nativism for good. Finally, being raised by millennial and Gen X parents will afford the centennials the chance to break free from the parental yoke earlier than the millennials. These parents are focusing on raising resilient children who have the permission to fail. You'll recall that the millennials were raised by helicopter parents who focus on protecting their children from problems large and small, real and imagined. This doesn't mean they'll be moving out on their own at 17, or that the same economic conditions that impacted the millennials won't have some effect on the centennials and their ability to achieve the traditional milestones of adulthood. It does mean, however, that we predict the centennials will be allowed to make their own decisions at an earlier age and be more responsible for the things that directly affect them, like what they have for dinner, choosing what classes to take, and where to apply for jobs. More importantly, they'll be given those chances to fail and to learn that they can handle that failure. Their independence will be more in keeping with Gen X independence, early, substantial, and often, but without the feral, latchkey aspect to it. So the questions then become, how will their relationship with their parents and their parents' influence over them differ from the millennials? What freedoms will the centennials be able to exercise earlier? And what tensions will arise from having an early sense of internal independence versus the harsh realities of life outside the home? We'll explore all of these topics and more in the upcoming year. All right, we're about at the end of our time today, so let's do some quick wrap-up. We've introduced you to a new generation, the centennials, and provided a reminder about who the millennials are, their formative years, and how those years are affecting them today. we can't overstate the importance of distinguishing between the two generational cohorts. In fact, no generation has ever lasted longer than 19 years. So if the centennials will be 18 next year, that means the next generation will start before or in 2017. So don't panic, we don't have a name for that group yet, but rest assured they are on our radar. We started studying the centennials 5 years ago, and we'll be ready to study the next generation when the time comes. So thank you for your time today. We want to encourage you to reach out to your account team and future company contacts if you have any questions, or if you'd like more information about anything that we've discussed here. Stay tuned for the release of the True Youth Monitor Perceptions and Priorities report in the next few weeks. And be sure to check out the Futures Gateway in early December for a special Centennials version of the Monitor download. For those who aren't familiar, the downloads are a series of interactive briefs that provide quick and critical foresight on key topics. The Centennials download will serve as a primer for this generation. And this is an ideal read for those looking to quickly get familiar with this next generation. This version of the download will be available in early December to all True Youth Monitor and U.S. Yankelovich Monitor subscribers. So again, thank you for your time today. And now we'll take some questions that we received during the call.
So one of the ones we got in is this. Is there more divergence or variability between subgroups of the centennials than the millennials? And in our fall report that will be released soon, we do dive into some of those differences and divergences. There are some noticeable ones. One of the values that we have is that we almost literally have a vault right next to our desk of reports back to our very first report in 1982. And we've been able to bring back some of the questions that helped us tease apart what millennials look like in their formative years, and are seeing some really interesting and powerful differences, some of which we teased out here today. We do see some more. Of course, one caveat is, while this group is certainly formed to some degree, they are still gelling, and things are yet to be determined. We've put a stake in the ground on a few things, believe very strongly in those things, and we'll continue to tease those apart as we go.
One of the other keys to this is something that we mentioned earlier with the hollowing of the middle class. So for the centennials, there will be more distinct socioeconomic groups than really there were for the millennials. And to Eric's point, they are young. We're starting to crystallize all of these insights and all of those implications, but as you can imagine, divergent socioeconomic groups will have a huge impact on brands as they're targeting the centennials, and a big impact on how you look at developing and then deploying your segmentations.
Looks like we might have one or more here. We're taking a look at some good questions, pretty full list. And we'll be following up on all these questions post-call as we're able.
Yes, so I will read a very easy one to answer. Will the deck be sent out to participants? Yes, it is being recorded. You will get a recording of the presentation as well as the opportunity to download the presentation through that email or on the Futures Gateway. The next question we have talks about the optimism that halos the millennials and the boomers in contrast to the stark reality facing centennials and their Gen X parents. So can we speak to that and how it will interact with their cynicism versus trust, kind of generally and then in relation to brands?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we have seen is, while yes, there are certainly a number of Gen X parents at the helm, there are also, just so we're clear, there are also millennial parents at the helm. One of the things that we have heard in some qualitative research is that while certainly Gen X parents are looking to, again, raise those resilient children, there's a bit of tempering on some of that more hard edge, if you will, that the Gen Xers had. And while I think what we've seen is that some of that is being passed a bit to centennials, it is a bit tempered. Gen Xers have realized that there were some shortcomings to all of that vinegar, if you will, in their day-to-day reactions to life as well as relationships with brands. But make no mistake, Gen Xers are leading the charge with raising these more astute, aware folks who can deal with the world around them and what it throws at them.
All right, we've got one more here. Can you talk about the need for the deep personal connection and how or why that's different from other generations? Is digital friending swinging to the desire for more real-life interactions? So we'll answer that kind of in the two parts that it came in. So I think we have seen for a while that digital friending is causing pretty much anyone who's active on social media to have that desire for those real-life interactions. I think what we're seeing with the centennials, because they are the digital natives, it's a bit easier for them to distinguish between the digital friendship and those real friendships. They're able to draw that line. They're just savvier with how they are using technology. For the millennials and for the Gen Xers and those boomers who are on social media, it still feels new and it still feels exciting. For these guys, for the centennials, that tempered approach to everything relates to their approach to social media as well. And that's something that we'll explore much more in our Consumers in Commerce report. We have a robust battery there of media behaviors and attitudes. So stay tuned for more on that in the spring. Second part of this question is about that need for deep personal connection. I think that will be really important as we look at that cultural intelligence that we know the centennials have really honed. They know that they need those connections to get ahead, and they are better at forging the important connections that will allow everybody's strengths to shine. So where the millennials really had that intrapersonal intelligence, and maybe they were a bit more tactical in their approaches to relationships and other people, we believe the centennials will be more strategic and a little bit maybe more well-rounded. So we are about at time. I do want to make sure that we take a look at the December Live. This will be one that you don't want to miss. It'll be hosted by our Executive Chairman, Jay Walker-Smith, and this is our annual Future View webinar. It takes a provocative view on the major changes impacting the marketplace and how brand marketers can and should respond. We'll be hosting it on December 10th at noon Eastern Time. So mark your calendars today. We want to say another thank you to everyone who attended today. Be on the lookout for the recording, and any questions that we didn't get to, we will be following up with you to answer those questions and talk about any other questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.